All right, well, good evening and welcome everybody to the LaRouche-initiated Fireside Chat. I'm Diane Sare. Dennis Speed is working on some things right now, and I think will be joining us later. And we have Mike Billington on this evening, and we're going to do a bit of a preview for the upcoming conference, which begins at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday morning. And I have to say, as often happens and particularly becomes likely because Helga has stressed, conferences are not single one-off events, but part of a series of activity. The timing of our conferences and the timing of extraordinary developments in the world seems almost as if it's coordinated. Now, as people are aware, on June 16th, there was the summit between President Biden and President Putin, and they released a communique which said, quoting from Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev from 1985, that they recognize that nuclear war is unwinnable and must never be fought. And that definitely makes them wiser than many insane people in the United States and certainly certain people in Britain, in the United Kingdom, as we're seeing in the last days. They also agreed that the ambassadors would return. As people may or may not know, Russia's ambassador had gone back to Moscow for consultations after Biden was sort of goaded into calling President Putin a killer on national television, and the U.S. ambassador to Russia came back to Washington. So here we've got the two major nuclear powers on the planet who did not even have high-level diplomatic representation going on, and it was agreed at the summit that these things will be restored. So the ambassadors have returned to their posts, but no sooner did Ambassador Antonov get off the airplane to return to the United States, but the United States announced a whole new round of ridiculous sanctions against Russia. And I do want to say something because I think this gets at a great deal of what we are dealing with these days, and something Mr. LaRouche was very concerned about had been really over years, and it's gotten much worse, which is the question of truth. The world, there is a principle of natural law. So it's true that you can say any kind of arbitrary thing. Now, you may not be able to say it publicly, as our freedom of speech is getting somewhat curtailed, but you can say the moon is made of pink coconuts if you want. But if you try to act as if that is the case, the universe will demonstrate to you that you are not correct. And therefore, if human beings actually want to be effective in the universe and to have power in the universe, then it is urgent that a method for knowing what is true, or knowing something with fewer and fewer blemishes or greater and greater approximation to the truth, is critical, and there also must be a commitment to that principle. That is why when we founded the United States, and under outrageous abuses being committed by the British Empire, this question of justice was one of the major issues, both itemized in all of our grievances in the Declaration of Independence, but also enshrined in the Constitution. We are supposed to have equal justice under the law. People are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. And we now have a culture which says, who cares about the truth? 99.3% of scientists say that human beings are causing climate change with CO2, or whatever it is. the local news. And if you disagree with that, you are not allowed to have an opinion. And people may remember that John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, who now is a newscaster, I always forget if he's at MSNBC or CNN, but wherever he is, as head of the CIA, he said, I don't do evidence. So think about that. I don't have to prove, I'm just going to act. In the Cuba Missiles Crisis, President Kennedy actually released, he had enough respect for the opinion of the population and also knew that he had to bring the American people together to recognize the danger, that the pictures indicating that missiles were being placed in Cuba by the Soviet Union were made public. But we entered a war with Iraq on baseless claims of weapons of mass destruction, and Nancy Pelosi, in the recent period, has told us that she knew that was a lie. In fact, she told us before Bush left office, she knew it was a lie. She knew they didn't exist, but she didn't think entering a war based on a lie, which killed over 1 million people in Iraq and to this date has killed 5,000 people in Iraq and 4 times that in suicides of veterans. She didn't consider lying about that to be an impeachable offense. So the ambassador of Russia, from Russia to Washington, returns to the United States, and we're putting more sanctions on Russia, allegedly because of the terrible abuse against Navalny. We want to put sanctions on China. We're denouncing China all the time for the alleged abuses of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. No one cares whether they can prove that's happening or not. And somehow people forget that we killed hundreds of thousands or over 1 million people who were probably Muslim in Iraq, created millions of refugees who were Muslim. Somehow we didn't care about any of them, but we're very, very concerned about the state of affairs of the Muslim population in Xinjiang. So my sense is we are really at a breaking point. We're at a turning point because it's become so crazy that many Americans, doesn't matter if they were right, left, up, down, supported Trump, didn't support Trump, they are getting to the point where they know their survival is on the line. So you have states that are rebelling against the 30 by 30, taking all this land and water out of production. There are parents who are rebelling about the disgusting things that are being taught to their children in schools. But does that mean that people know what they need? Does it mean that they know what's true? Now, on this escalation with Russia, so immediately the ambassadors get back, and it's not clear, is the United States going to live up to what was stated by the presidents in that communique? And to make sure that things are complicated, you had an incident which I hope most people have heard of. It hasn't really gotten the press coverage it should have, where the British sent a destroyer into the Black Sea. It violated the Russian territorial waters, and in fact by 3 kilometers. So the Russians first fired warning shots over the bow of the ship. It didn't stop. They ended up dropping high explosive bombs in front of the destroyer to get their message across, and the destroyer finally stopped. This kind of lunacy is exactly, in a world that's already somewhat destabilized, this kind of lunacy, this lunatic chicken game, is exactly how we might find ourselves in a nuclear war. And it's being discussed now in various locations what that would look like. People might remember that Lyndon LaRouche used to say, if you start a nuclear war, it's all over in 90 minutes. The whole world is gone, because there are responses that will occur, and you're setting off something which is an unstoppable process. So this was extremely dangerous. Now the question is, how do you get out of this? And it requires not merely an agreement to not have nuclear war, but you have to have an agreement on how to build the peace. How is that done? Through very specific cooperation. Helga LaRouche has been very clear that the pandemic, which has taken the lives of, I guess it's somewhere between 3 and 4 million people worldwide, over 600,000 in the United States, and we're rapidly approaching that level, that in Brazil, gives us, in a sense, the answer, because if we want to actually stop this, then it will require nations cooperating, and it will require a crash program to raise the standard of living. Just having a vaccine is not enough, and even if everybody were vaccinated against COVID-19 and we stop this virus, what guarantees that we stop the next one? I think everybody would agree that having clean water, adequate nutrition, a non-stressful life where you're not getting bombed or worried about things collapsing on you, a stable situation, good transportation, 24/7 electricity, that having these things as standard and normal and expected for the entirety of your population is going to make you a lot less likely to be very sick. And therefore, if we want to actually get mankind to the next level of development, that we have to cooperate to establish a modern health system in every nation. Just in the U.S. alone, this would require about 1,500 new coal-fired power plants, clean coal, while we're scrambling to get our productive capabilities back to build nuclear power. So we have an enormous amount to do. There's an enormous amount is needed. The conference is a rallying point. In fact, I would encourage everyone on the call to think of it as a rally, that we want people to be there to show their support for the development of the potential of mankind versus the Malthusian bestial outlook of the British Empire. And what I think Mike is going to do this evening is to give us a sense of what is going to be happening on the first day of the conference and the importance of that. So, Mike, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks, Diane. Yeah, so hopefully you all know, and you're circulating the schedule for the conference this weekend. I'm going to look at the first two panels. The first one, Whom the Gods Would Destroy, War with Russia and China is Worse Than MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. And the second one, The Real Science Behind Climate Change, Why the World Needs 7 terawatts of energy. And just to make sure you know, the third panel, the first panel on Sunday, is going to be on the hyperinflation. Weimar Germany, 1923 comes again. Global Glass-Steagall Policy to End Hyperinflation. And the fourth, The Coincidence of Opposites, the Only Truly Human Thought Process. What I'm going to do is look at the first two panels and go back and review. Most of you will know some of this. Review Lynn's work in bringing about the situation we're in now, or I should say, how he had warned that this situation would come about and laid out precisely what had to be done to prevent this. So look at the first one, Whom the Gods Would Destroy, War with Russia and China is Worse Than MAD, MAD. I think you all know what MAD stands for, Mutual Assured Destruction. This was the insane imperial idea of the British, and backed by the neocons and the realists, so-called, the Henry Kissinger types, George Shultz. The idea was the Russians, the Soviets at that time, could blow us up, we could blow them up, and therefore nobody's going to start a war because it would mean mutual assured destruction. Well, that's fine and good, but LaRouche looked at this and said, well, that's insane. This is the permanent division of the war. It's not going to stop a nuclear war.
Hello.
All it does is give the British the capacity to wage colonial wars around the world without worrying that's going to spark a nuclear war, and to continue looting the world without any concern that this is going to blow up into a global nuclear war, supposedly no concern. And Lynn's view was, this is crazy. We need to bring the world together around the common aims of mankind. We have to use the coincidence of opposites idea, that if you're locked into this fixed war posture of warring blocks, then you rise above that and say, let's get together. We both have huge military industrial complexes. We both have great scientists. But most of their time and energy is being wasted developing weapons of destruction, rather than working towards the pushing forward in the frontiers of human knowledge for development, for space travel, and things needed by the human race. So let's do away with mutual assured destruction. Let's work together and build a space-based anti-missile defense system which can use the frontiers of human knowledge in particle beam and laser beam technologies, relativistic beam capacities to knock out missiles and basically make them impotent. So this goes. Let me sort of go back a minute and say that this agreement that was reached between Biden and Putin to say that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought was indeed said by Reagan and Gorbachev back in 1985, November, which was just 2 years after Reagan had adopted LaRouche's idea, which he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, on March 23rd of 1983. But, Gorbachev didn't agree with that idea. Neither did Schultz, Kissinger, or emphatically the British. They wanted arms limitation. They thought we should try to come to agreements to limit how much the arms race was wasting money and so forth. But they would not give up mutual assured destruction. Why? Because that's the basis on which the world is kept divided, that the human race is not allowed to come together around their actual self-interests. So LaRouche, again, the coincidence of opposites, said, let's bring these scientists together to do what's needed. And Reagan, of course, when he adopted Lynn's program, said that we are going to make nuclear weapons obsolete. He did reach out to the Russians to join them. He had called upon Lyndon LaRouche over the previous year to carry out back-channel negotiations with the Soviets, which he did, calling on them to join in this effort. At that time, the Russians were run by what were essentially British agents, Andropov, and people like Georgy Arbatov, who was the head of the U.S.-Canada Institute, and others who were part of this mad doctrine, who agreed with not allowing the world to come together. So in the 1985 meeting, Gorbachev and Reagan discussed this, and they came to the agreement there shouldn't be a nuclear war, but they didn't come to an agreement on the SDI. That came to a head the next year. There was another summit between Reagan and Gorbachev in October of 1986, a year later. The meeting was to take place on October 11th and 12th, but the people planning the meeting were arriving in Reykjavik on October 7th. Earlier that year, Olof Palme had been murdered in Sweden, and the Russians and many in the West accused Lyndon LaRouche, whom they now considered a demon because he'd proposed this idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, of accusing him of killing Olof Palme. They even made a video with a person playing LaRouche, a devious person who was plotting the killing of Olof Palme. So this was all going on when this Reykjavik conference was going to take place, October 7th. Now, I hope all of you know what happened the day before that, on October 6th, 1986. that was the day of the Great Leesburg Panty Raid, where several hundred federal, state, and local officials, armed to the teeth with helicopters, armed personnel carriers, and so forth, raided Leesburg, broke down the door of our office, took off truckloads of all of our records. That morning, my wife, Gail, my late wife, Gail, took the garbage down to the end of the lane where we lived, only to see that there were dozens of armed men and police cars and other kinds of cars, and of course the media with their truck there with their aerials and so forth. If those of you who watched what happened to Roger Stone when he was raided at 6 in the morning, where they carefully had notified CNN, know exactly what happened to us that morning and several others. So she came back and we called in, and sure enough, there was this raid going on. They said, sit tight, they're going to come up and get you in a minute. And so John and Renee Sigerson, who lived across the street, called over, and I said, well, why don't you come on over? So they did, and they told the people out at the end of the lane that they were coming to visit me. And they came in, and we put on a video of Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, and we're calmly watching an opera when finally they decided to come in and get this evil, mean man with arms, all their guns pulled, Uzis, and of course the media truck pulling right up into my yard. Gail went running out and told the media, get the hell off our property, which they had to do. But the others grabbed me and put me in chains and threw me in the car and took me into Alexandria, where they were filming all of us being frog marched, as they call it, where you have shackles around your feet and your arms. This was all on TV. So this is all on October 6th. That was at the same time they had encircled Lynn's property. They knew that Lynn had security that were armed. And there's no question, we know from intelligence sources, that the plan was to have a shootout, and they wanted Lynn to be dead by the end of the day. And Lynn wrote a telegram to Reagan, who, of course, knew Lynn quite well and had adopted his program for the SDI. And he told Reagan that the blood would be on his hands if this was not called off, and it was called off. And they subsequently just gave Lynn's lawyers the arrest warrant. And things proceeded from there. Now, what happened the next day? All of the media arrived in Reykjavik to watch this summit, where the word was out. Reagan is going to give up the SDI in exchange for an arms limitation agreement with Gorbachev. That was cut in stone. Now, especially since the author of the SDI, LaRouche, was totally contained, and therefore it was no question that was going to happen. So all the media were gathered. The TVs in the media room were full of video of all of us being marched around and thrown in jail, and the people knocking down our door and carrying out our goods and so forth. So this was the message. The SDI author is gone. It's finished. This guy Gorby Arbitov, who hated us, screamed at our reporters there, "You're fascist, this filthy magazine, EIR." And the media were just lapping it up, and they were sure that the SDI was dead. And then finally Reagan and Gorbachev met on October 11th and 12th, and George Shultz walked out with his eyes sagging and his mouth pouting and said, "There's no deal. Reagan won't give up the SDI." So this is the history of this. He wouldn't do it, and Lynn knew he wouldn't do it because he actually knew that mutual assured destruction was going to lead to war and disaster, and was committed to these ideas. Now, he, as we know now, was already beginning to show signs of this dementia. George Bush systematically took over the government. The SDI was sabotaged in favor of anti-missile missiles, which was really just part of mutual assured destruction, and the whole idea of a new era of science and human knowledge was basically wiped out. But what it shows is the power of ideas, that you're dealing here with a powerful idea by an individual and a small organizational force which permeated the world and had the chance of becoming reality. And of course, when the wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union fell, and Lynn got out of prison about 5 years later, I guess, we learned that the Russian Academy of Science had been carefully studying Lynn's work. They knew that he was unique, not only in following so-called American system economics of Hamilton, but that he advanced on that dramatically through the LaRouche-Riemann economic model, that he was pursuing relativistic ideas in economics, which they recognized as unique and crucial, locating the development of humanity in the development of new ideas in the minds of men, which transform the technology, which transform our ability to create platforms of production. So I won't go into that now. Hopefully you've all studied this before. So let me switch over to panel 2, the real science behind climate change. And just like we went back 40 years to show that LaRouche was leading the efforts that could have stopped wars back then, could have stopped the situation we're in today, actually. Same thing here. Here's a publication from November of 1997 by the 21st Century Science and Technology Organization. In the 1986 raid, as you probably know, the Fusion magazine, which we had produced, the most widely subscribed to science magazine in America, the only one unabashedly pro-nuclear, pro-fusion, pro-science. But they had shut that down. So we then started this 21st Century Science and Technology, and in 1987, November, we published a special report called The Coming Ice Age, Why Global Warming is a Scientific Fraud. Now, this is almost a quarter century ago, and yet this is what was already being put out in both political detail and scientific detail. Those of you, hopefully all of you, have read the pamphlet that we published this year called The Great Leap Backward, LaRouche Crushes the Green New Deal. In that, Richard Freeman reviews the whole history of Prince Charles, Prince Philip, the British, back in 1992, launching the first of these climate change summits. It was called the Earth Summit or the Rio Summit. It was in Rio. But it was launched then by Charles with Philip's backing, the people who believed in Malthusianism, who wanted to be reincarnated as viruses to help solve the leading problem in the world, which is overpopulation. So all of this was brought together, and they introduced the idea that it was carbon was the problem. We had to do away with carbon in order to end anthropogenic climate change. That meant, of course, shutting down industry, shutting down farms, shutting down fossil fuels, and this was all launched. The Secretary General of that Earth Summit was Maurice Strong, one of Charles and George Soros's close buddies, and this whole process was unleashed. You can read that in that pamphlet. You'll also see that it was the Brits who introduced the idea of the Green New Deal, not Bernie Sanders or AOC, back in 2008. Now, this magazine, The Coming Ice Age, the first whole section is on eco-fascism, Malthusianism. I don't need to go through that. It's largely reproduced by Richard, who advanced upon what we had then as well. But the second part is on the scientific fraud. And I'm just going to name a few of the scientists who we were working with a quarter of a century ago. Dr. Robert E. Stevenson, who's known as the father of space oceanography. He's an oceanographer who trained our astronauts to be able to read the ocean from space. He published, actually in an earlier version of our magazine, an article called Oceanographer Looks at the Non-Science of Global Warming. And when he published that in the earlier issue of 21st Century Science, he got dozens and dozens of letters from all over the world of leading scientists just thanking him for finally telling the truth amongst all the nonsense that was being peddled by that time. And in the special report, we published some of those letters from Australia, China, from the U.S., Scotland, Russia, Germany, and others. His article starts out, not so long ago, in the early 1970s, climate scientists thought in 100,000-year cycles, or at least 10,000-year cycles, and they knew that we were heading into a new ice age. Another scientist, Zbigniew Jaworski, a very famous radiologist, a Polish guy, but who took leading positions at the UN, in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and in the Atomic Energy Agency, basically wrote about the ice ages, the 100,000-year ice age cycles, which he said came from the periodicity, the eccentricity, the tilt, and the precession of the equinox in Earth's orbit. In other words, these are not defined by what's going on locally on Earth. They're defined by the fact that the oval, the path of the Earth shifts, the size of the oval orbit shifts somewhat. There's a periodicity, there's the precession, and so forth. These things can be studied and determine why we have these 100,000-year ice age cycles with 10,000-year interglacial periods between them. And, he pointed out, we are at the end of an interglacial. Therefore, we can very well expect that we'll be heading into a new ice age within the relatively short term. He also did the definitive work on studying ice core data, refuting those who claimed that the ice core data showed that we had too much carbon dioxide. Now he showed that there was no more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than there were in other ages. Dixie Lee Ray, you may remember her. She was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission and also the governor of Washington State, a very, very good friend of ours, very pro-nuclear. She had an article in this report called Environmental Overkill, Whatever Happened to Common Sense? And another one called Global Warming, Ozone Depletion, Where's the Evidence? Ozone depletion. The younger of you in the audience probably don't even know about this, but back then there was another scientific hoax called the depletion of the ozone or the growth of the ozone hole, claiming that human activity was causing the depletion of the ozone layer, which protected us. We're all going to die if we don't stop using aerosols and don't have air conditioning and very crazy things that you don't hear about anymore because it was all nonsense. Just like eventually, if we survive, this whole climate change thing is going to be recognized as nonsense, as Chicken Little screaming the sky is falling. Another scientist named Elsasser, who was for 21 years the head of the Air Force Weather Station, and then for 23 more years was at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories heading up their weather and climate piece. And he wrote a piece for this journal called What You Never Heard About Greenhouse Warming, Fact, Fiction, and the Global Warming Fraud. So this is not new. We've been at this for many, many, many years. And I will close just by asking you to think about how this current disaster, the threat of nuclear war, the genocide, the Malthusianism, the deindustrialization, and the inability to even meet an epidemic, how could this have been prevented? And there's actually one relatively easy answer, which is LaRouche could have been exonerated. And if Bill Clinton, who was definitely considering exonerating Lyndon LaRouche, or even Trump, who sure as hell should have, he knew that the people running the operation against him were literally the same individuals, the British and American, Robert Miller and others, were after him, were the people who ran the Get LaRouche Task Force back in the 1980s. He knew that. Why in the hell didn't he exonerate him? But if Clinton had exonerated him, as he should have, and was close to doing, supposedly, according to various sources, think what would have happened. All right? People would have been forced to think, or it's better to say they would have been liberated to think about these profound ideas. They would have been shocked into saying, well, what is it that LaRouche actually thinks? Why is it that he was under this attack? And these powerful ideas would have been permeated rapidly through the country and through the world. All right? So this is not just, gee, our guy was treated badly, he should be free. This was a fight to break the destruction of thought, to the battle by the British Empire to prevent human beings from thinking in a certain way, what Helga calls the coincidence of opposites, the only truly human thought process. And that's what was attacked. And it could have been changed. It's still the issue today. To break this vile, evil attack on humanity as a whole that took the form of crushing LaRouche and trying to crush him and his organization. They didn't. We're here. We now have in our hands the capacity to carry this fight forward, and we have allies around the world, which we've demonstrated in each of these conferences, that we, in a certain sense, we alone are looked to by Russia, by China, by others in Africa, in South America, and within Europe and the United States as the only institution who can actually put together that combination of forces that has the capacity to implement a new paradigm for mankind. So I'll leave it at that. Let's talk about it.